Architecture at the University of Liverpool. He is here with us and he will be talking about complexity and contradiction in cultural landscape, possible approaches to heritage management in Chandernagore. May I now request our INTACH member, Purva Chatterjee, to introduce Professor Bandyopadhyay, and then we will listen to his lecture.
Good evening and welcome all to the 8th talk of the online open lecture series entitled Deliberations on the Uncharted Hooghly, History, Heritage and Humanity, organized by the INTACH Hooghly Chapter. Today, it is with great pleasure that we introduce you to Professor Saumyen Bandyopadhyay. Well, introduce is a word I wouldn't like to use it here, for it could amount to a certain degree of temerity on our part, because Professor Bandyopadhyay simply needs no introduction. He is such a revered figure in the world of academia, where his achievements speak volumes, and hence a straitjacket formal introduction may be out of place. But on the other hand, it is always so nice to speak of someone who is from your own town, who has achieved so much and yet is so down to earth and so attached to his roots. Professor Saumyen Bandyopadhyay is the head of school and the Sir James Stirling Chair in Architecture at the Liverpool School of Architecture, having previously held professional positions at the Manchester School of Architecture and Nottingham Trent University. He directs the Centre for the Study of Architecture and Cultural Heritage of India, Arabia and Maghreb, collectively called the ARCIAM, an interdisciplinary forum with research projects in Oman, Qatar, Morocco and India. ARCIAM has undertaken heritage research, master planning, training, and heritage implementation work in Oman and Morocco. More recently, ARCIAM has completed the Phase 1 interventions in a mountain settlement in Oman. ARCIAM, working with the Qatar National Library, has developed a major digital archive on Gulf architecture and urbanism, as well as an online encyclopedia with a view to it becoming the world's largest digital archive on this subject. In India, ARCIAM has been working in Srirangapatna and Bijapur, as well as in the Hooghly River region, with a major focus on Chandernagore. Professor Bandyopadhyay has extensive experience of architectural practice in India and the Middle East and has undertaken advisory and consultancy work in urban development, regeneration, architectural and urban design, and conservation. In addition to his published works in journals, he is also the author of Site and Composition, Routledge, 2016, Mana, Omani Oasis, Arabian Legacy, Liverpool University Press, 2011, and is the co-editor of The Territories of Identity, Routledge, 2013, The Humanities in Architectural Design, Routledge, 2010, and Thinking Practice, Black Dog, 2007. For his deliberation today, Professor Bandyopadhyay has again returned to his roots, to his hometown, Chandernagore. He will be speaking on complexity and contradiction in cultural landscape, possible approaches to heritage management in Chandernagore. I hope all of you will enjoy his insightful approach to a topic which is so pertinent and which in the long run can involve not only us, but our future generations as well. A very warm welcome to Professor Saumyen Bandyopadhyay from all of us here at INTACH Hooghly. And now, sir, it's over to you.
Thank you, Purva. Good evening, everyone. আমি প্রথমে এক সেকেন্ড আমি আগে প্রেজেন্টেশনটা
হ্যাঁ, দেখতে পাওয়া
যাচ্ছে। আমি জাস্ট বলবো, হ্যাঁ, ওকে, ওকে,
ফুল স্ক্রিন।
ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
ওকে,
এখন ফুল স্ক্রিন দেখা যাচ্ছে তো?
হ্যাঁ,
ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ। আমি প্রথমে গুড ইভিনিং। আমি প্রথমে সংক্ষেপে বাংলায় একটু বলে নিতে চাই, যাতে আপনাদেরও বোঝাতে পারি আমি যে আমি কি বলতে চাইছি এই টকটার মধ্যে দিয়ে। কমপ্লেক্সিটি এন্ড কন্ট্রাডিকশন ইন কালচারাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপ। তো আমার ধারণা যে নগর এবং স্থাপত্য ঐতিহ্যের অনস্বীকার্য অঙ্গ হলো জটিলতা, দ্বন্দ্ব আর অসামঞ্জস্য, যেটাকে আমি কমপ্লেক্সিটি এন্ড কন্ট্রাডিকশন বলছি। এই স্থানীয় বৈচিত্র্য আর দ্বৈততাই হলো ঐতিহ্যের ঐশ্বর্য আর তার মূল ভিত্তি। আমার আজকের বক্তব্য প্রথমত চন্দননগরের এই স্থানীয় বৈচিত্র্যের একটা ছবি তুলে ধরা। এই তুলে ধরার মধ্যে আমি এই বৈচিত্র্যকে সঠিকভাবে চর্চা করার কথা বলছি। সেই চর্চা করতে হলে আমাদের প্রয়োজন বিশদ বাস্তব আর নৃতাত্ত্বিক ডকুমেন্টেশন, মানে ফিজিক্যাল অ্যান্ড এথনোগ্রাফিক ডকুমেন্টেশন আর গবেষণা, আর প্রয়োজন সেই প্রেক্ষিতে ব্যাখ্যা। এই ব্যাখ্যার মধ্যে শুধু একটাই সত্যি কিন্তু নিহিত থাকে না, অনেকগুলো সত্যি থাকে। যে কারণে আমি কমপ্লেক্সিটি এবং কন্ট্রাডিকশনের কথা বলছি। আমাদের দৈনন্দিন জীবনযাত্রা আর আচার ব্যবহার নগর স্থাপত্যের বিভিন্ন অংশকে বিভিন্নভাবে ছুঁয়ে যায়। ফলে বিভিন্ন সাংস্কৃতিক ভূদৃশ্য বা কালচারাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপ এর সৃষ্টি হয়। নগর ঐতিহ্যের ক্ষেত্রে এই কালচারাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপের দৃষ্টিকোণটা কিন্তু খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। দুর্ভাগ্যবশত আমাদের ঐতিহ্যের চিন্তাভাবনা এখনো মনুমেন্ট স্পেসিফিক বা বিশেষ স্থাপত্য ভিত্তিক সেইভাবেই রয়ে গেছে। এর বিরুদ্ধ প্রভাব ভবিষ্যৎ নগর পরিকল্পনার উপর সর্বত্রই চোখে পড়ে, যার ফলে আমাদের নগর পরিকল্পনা, আমাদের আর্কিটেকচার, আমাদের স্থাপত্য খুবই অবিন্যস্ত রয়ে গেছে। শেয়ার্ড হেরিটেজের বোধ বা ঐতিহ্যের অংশীদারিতা এর ফলে এসেছে কমে। শেয়ার্ড হেরিটেজের বোধ কিন্তু ঐতিহ্য বাঁচাতে আমাদের খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। সুতরাং ঐতিহ্য রক্ষায় কোঅপারেটিভ বা সমবায়িকা ভিত্তিক পথ বা পন্থার প্রয়োজন আছে, বিশেষত যেখানে শরিকি বা অংশীদারি ঐতিহ্যের প্রসঙ্গ আসে। সবশেষে আমি আমাদের লিভারপুল ইউনিভার্সিটি ভিত্তিক গবেষণা কেন্দ্র আর্কিয়াম, যেটা অ্যাক্রোনিম ছোটভাবে দাঁড়ায় আর্কিটেকচার এবং কালচারাল হেরিটেজ অফ ইন্ডিয়া, আরেবিয়া অ্যান্ড মাগরেব, এই রিসার্চ সেন্টার দ্বারা কৃত ওমানে একটি ঐতিহ্য সংরক্ষণ বা হেরিটেজ ম্যানেজমেন্ট প্রকল্পের বাস্তবায়নের একটা ছোট ছবি আমি তুলে ধরতে চাই। এক্ষেত্রে আমার বলার মূল উদ্দেশ্য এই যে সংরক্ষণ বা কনজারভেশন যেমন প্রয়োজন বিশেষত সার্বজনীন বিশেষ ঐতিহ্যের ক্ষেত্রে, তেমনি ডোমেস্টিক বা গৃহ ঐতিহ্যের ক্ষেত্রে নতুনতা আনা বা পরিবর্তনেরও খুবই প্রয়োজন আছে। এই পরিবর্তনের জন্য প্রয়োজন আমাদের উপযুক্ত সংবেদনশীলতা, যা আমাদের স্থপতি আর পরিকল্পক সকলেরই উদ্বুদ্ধতায় নির্মিত হবে। তো এই ছোট্ট সংক্ষেপে আমার অ্যাবস্ট্রাক্টটা বলে আমি শুরু করতে চাই। আশা করি আমি বাংলায় মেইন লেকচারটা আমি ইংরেজিতে দিলেও আমি বাংলায় প্রশ্নের উত্তর দেব এবং চেষ্টা করছি আমি 40 থেকে 45 মিনিটের মধ্যে এটা শেষ করতে। আশা করি আপনাদের ভালো লাগবে। The complexity and contradiction, I am actually borrowing from a title of a very well-known book in architecture and urban design, which is by Robert Venturi, an American architect and thinker, who wrote a book in the late 60s about complexity and contradiction, which for the first time probably brought out the idea that culture is full of contradictions, but also architecture is full of contradictions. Urban design, urban landscapes are full of contradictions. So I'm looking at it from that perspective, that this is not a single monolithic culture. It is made out of many, many cultural strands. And within that, I'm trying to understand what kind of a possible approach could we take for the management of heritage in Chandernagore. Chandernagore being an example here, of course, we need to talk about Chandernagore as an example standing in for the Hooghly region, for the whole of India, if we want to talk about it. And I'll just, this first couple of slides, I'm just hoping to show you some aspects of the human creative mind. You know, if you look into Daulatabad Fort, this one on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, there is a little bit of a detail of a stone, which may have been taken from a Hindu temple at some point, but it was inserted into the wall and became part of it. So in a way, our cultures become, for whatever reason it is, a montage, what you can call a collage or a montage, or sometimes it can be called a palimpsest. So there are many, many ideas which are coming through, shining through at the same time. And these ideas are not of the same time or the same period or from the same angle or perspective. So again, in a more recent time, if you look into the Chandigarh, in Chandigarh, there is the Nekchand's Rock Garden, which is one of the most visited touristic sites in India. In fact, second to Taj Mahal only. This is the rock garden which was created by a road inspector called Nekchand, who during the day used to work as a road inspector. At night, he would become a sculptor. And so he created this fantastic landscape within which there are so many fragments of the old villages that used to be in Chandigarh, which were dismantled. On the left-hand side, the map shows the dark patches on the map, shows the various villages which were destroyed to create the city of Chandigarh. But these fragments all got dumped in a dump yard, which was where the rock garden is now. And you can see these fragments of little bits of icons to all kinds of other artifacts of everyday use that has become part of this kind of the rock garden. So this issue of our culture, our material culture, our buildings, our cities and our landscapes are, they represent different times, different periods, different sensibilities, different projections and so on over a long period of time. And that's something that we need to recognize. And that is where our creativity and diversity lies. Now, I will start with the Chandernagore heritage documentation as a first point, and I'll tell you in a moment why. Aishwarya Tipnis had done some very good work, excellent work during, say about 10 years back on the documentation of the key heritage sites in Chandernagore. And there are a couple of documents that I cite here on the right-hand side. And some of the things that, they, and rightfully they were doing was to identify kind of a typological study. The typological study of French houses. So one of the things that she and the team established was different typologies. On the left-hand side, I kind of highlight the key ones that they talk about. They talk about the French house, they talk about the French townhouse, they talk about the French garden house, Indo-French townhouse, Indo-French Rajbari. Now, these are, while very valid, but I would say that these are oversimplification of the types that exist in Chandernagore, of house types that exist in Chandernagore. And I think unless we begin to understand how diverse and how complex these are, and that they cannot be so easily categorized under these headers, that we can actually begin to understand the qualities that we need to protect and we need to conserve. So the conservation does not mean literally a conservation of a brick or a stone, but the conservation of the spirit, conservation of the idea, the conservation of a type, the conservation of space organization. That is crucial for us. So here, of course, very rightly again, and I think I must say that this is a really good piece of work, but it comes up to a point. It does not actually give us a kind of full picture, and that's my point about it. So here you have a really good study of door types and window types, over here. And they all are very useful, but they're also very limiting. And what I would like to talk about here is that just to highlight the complexities of it. And I'm sure that today we have many in the congregation, who are much more knowledgeable about Chandernagore than I am. But I'm simply taking a perspective from the point of view of a heritage site and what can we do for address the heritage site. And I'm bringing in my experience in that way. So in order from the World Heritage Site perspective, and I think that Hooghly, the river region, can actually become a World Heritage Site. It can actually it has all the qualities of it, but for that we need to undertake a huge amount of work, and that work has to be undertaken not by one individual or the government, but this is the call that I'm trying to make, and that is that everyone has to come together. Everyone has to contribute to it. And so if you have to look into this sort of outline of what has to be done to prepare ourselves for a World Heritage Site, and I'm giving this as an example, that we have to do relevant background research, we have to do develop comparative analysis, prepare the draft statement of outstanding universal value and identify criteria, define relevant attributes, then assess authenticity and integrity, define appropriate boundaries, prepare descriptions, prepare history, and complete remaining nomination dossiers. So what I'm trying to say is that, see, this is not only about saying, well, this is a great house, that is a great house, that's a great building, and so on. But what I'll try to show is that this idea of cultural landscape, that it is not about just individual buildings or individual sites, but collectively how they come together to talk about our culture, talk about our activities. And that's what is important for a World Heritage Site to bring together. And I think that we do lack that particular approach at this moment. And that's why I think the key themes for me is that when we talk about, in the previous one, the universal values, the outstanding universal value, where does that come from? The outstanding universal value does not come from saying we are unique in the world, nobody else has done it in this way. I don't think that is the case. What it makes and what it really means is that local cultural uniqueness and qualities that are in a way imbued by our engagement, our activities, our actions, and so on, that is what collectively brings together a universal, outstanding universal value. And that is why it is very important to uphold the local, regional heritage values. And that is something that I'll talk about. I will also talk about how it's important to understand how things change, because nothing is static. No history is stable and static. It is changing every moment. Even the moment that I've just spoken has gone. So therefore it's in the past. So it is important to understand that nothing is static and we should not keep things static. So therefore, heritage has to be looked at in a dynamic way. And therefore the cultural landscape formation, which is always changing, has to be taken into account in that way. So the other thing that is important, as I was saying, that community, the involvement of the community, but also the involvement of cooperatives and so on, which I'll talk about. Also, the heritage has to be inclusive. So when we are interpreting, when we are interpreting that material, we should be inclusive. It is not about my heritage or somebody else's heritage, it's about everyone's heritage. And those multiplicities has to come together. And then finally, it's also about how do we take it forward? Because heritage is not static, as I was saying. So we need to think about how we take this forward, and I'll show some examples later on. Sorry, why does it stay? Just 1 second. Okay, so just starting with a quick review of, say, columns and capitals, within this. You have so many different complexities in that. We can see that there are Corinthian capitals, there are, over here you have some kind of Ionic type capitals, but they are also sitting in relation to other decorative styles and patterns, which are completely different. But in the Ghats here, we find much simpler, sort of Doric, almost a Doric pattern. And then you have the combination of these things. But also, let's not forget, in these puja mandaps, we have other kinds of columns, but also other kinds of arches and so on. So this incredible complexity of the architecture that we find, and that is also true in the case of like balconies and balustrades and so on and so forth. You have quite a lot of diversity in this sort of area. But if you look into that, what is interesting is that even within that sort of general Western language that we can find in these particular examples, or the examples that we have here, we begin to see that there is a mixture of indigenous qualities or sort of local characteristics. So for example, in this particular one, the same from a distance, it looks very similar, but when you come closer to it, you find that Krishna and Radha and the depictions of those are really important part of that. Simply because that this particular house also contains a temple dedicated to Radha and Krishna, and that is what then begins to actually qualify and characterize the building and their small bits of their architecture. So isn't it quite exciting and interesting that I think this diversity and this complexity comes through even within a kind of organization which may be apparently read as a kind of French, Indo-French house type. Now, looking at, therefore, the local and regional values and enhancing those local values, I think we need to think about how we can begin to understand and we can begin to pull together this kind of character into the typological studies and morphological studies of it. Now let's look at building plans. Now we have here many of the houses in Chandernagore have courtyards. Now these courtyards are not just part of a kind of like a Rajbari type house, but also it is appearing in many types of houses. But also, let's not forget, very importantly, the rock, which is a quintessential Chandernagore or a Bengali thing, that is a rock and rocky bushe damara, that is gossiping on sitting down on this rock. The word rock comes from the Arabic word of riwak, which is nothing to do with a bench, but it's actually a tent flap under which possibly people, the warriors and the kings possibly sat outside during a cooler weather, but shaded from the sun. Now, if you look into these depictions of the facades that Titmuss was trying to put together, there's very little actual representation of the understanding of the rock, and what actually it does to make the place work. And neither is a full understanding of the courtyard there. So if we think about that, the rock is not only there as a little bit of a prelude to it, it is an integral part of the elevation. It is an integral part of it. So it begins to break down the Indo-French elevational structure by actually bringing in a new element into that level. And it does all kinds of purposes. Not only that it's there for sitting down to have a discussion, but it also becomes a kind of storage area, as you can see, for the the structures for the Thakur, which is there, but also it is an access point. It is a way of actually providing a boundary between the street and the, as you can see on the right hand side, providing a boundary between the street and the house. So this complexity has to be understood in terms of the typology. So the rock is not only one type, there are plenty of types. Again, for the utilitarian courtyard. Now the courtyard has been used, if you look into that building, the plan over here, this building is accessed from the side, so not from the main entrance side mainly, but the main entrance had possibly the living room or the barrier car, in the front, but the actual entrance to the house was from the side. So that actually emphasizes the very utilitarian nature of the courtyard. It's not a formal courtyard, if you like. Now, here, that utilitarian courtyard takes up different shapes and forms. You have, that as a kind of integral part of your domestic life, and you can see that here. But also the entrances begin to become depicted in different ways, as you can see, a particular art and so on. So how differently we enter it, where is an entrance in relation to a courtyard, is quite important too. So let's look at also a variation of this theme in a couple of houses. In fact, the left-hand side house is the house that I grew up and spent a lot of my time, and my neighboring property, which is Sleepy Hollow, which is in Lal Bagan. Both are in Lal Bagan. And I would like to show how they slightly differently talk about social status, talk about a particular organizational principle, and so on. So in this house in Sleepy Hollow, you find that there was a courtyard in the middle of an older house. Now, the older house then was added to in the front. So the front bit that you're seeing in this photograph on the left-hand side is essentially an add-on thing. It was an addition to make it look Western. It wasn't originally a Western house. It was essentially a very Bengali courtyard house, and to which this front facade was added, which was done in a Palladian European style. So that then actually made that the fact that you entered it from the front. So therefore, there was a direct actual relationship between the western part, the facade part, and the original courtyard house that used to exist. So there was an axial continuity in it. However, if you look into the other house, what happened? The same person sort of built this house. It was a double-story structure, so obviously much more formidable Palladian sort of facade in the front, with all kinds of other additions and so on. But then, if you look into the courtyard, what happens is, so here the building becomes this U-shaped blue patch is the building. It becomes a kind of more formal evocation beyond a facade. It becomes a formal evocation of a living style. So therefore, that is presented as one. But look what happens to the courtyard. The courtyard originally was actually put to the side. So the whole domestic life was rotating around this courtyard over here and the kind of adjoining buildings, the structure. Whereas the main structure, which also included the living rooms in the upper level, was not a very functional building, but more a kind of architectural statement, if you like, about the kind of culture that they were representing. So by putting the courtyard to the side and not putting it axially, it begins to make a different statement about how the building was organized and what was given importance and not. Okay, so if we look into now the kind of larger courtyard houses, the Thakurdalan type, which again, Titmus sort of very quickly says that it is the Indo-French house. But if you look into the variety of those, that's extraordinary and incredible. And those, you can see here that, they differ in the sense that the entrance is actually formally from the main street. So therefore, it is not a side street, so it's not a utilitarian courtyard, it is a kind of main courtyard. So the same thing happens here too, although the entrance is much narrower on the right-hand side, but it still goes into the same thing. So this idea that not all the courtyards are the same has to be kind of looked at very carefully as well. So you see the depictions here, you see the various kinds of cultural strands and decorative strands which are coming into it. Now, those things then also have an impact on the facade. How different can the facades be? Now, these two facades are not the same. If you look into the right-hand side, the kind of work, in terms of creating the entrance space, although it's shallow and it's differently dealt with, it's a much different type of a building than the building on the left-hand side. And, so therefore, what I'm trying to show up to here is that not only that we look into the local characteristics and how they've changed and morphed in different places, it is very important to understand that these have genealogical connections, like a family tree. Some parts of it have a family lineage, and then they come together with other family lineages and so on. So moving into the cultural landscape. So this is about the buildings, and I think it is very important that I'm suggesting that we look into how we can actually pull this, the various parts of it together and better understand it. So the typology of the houses are much wider than what was originally being pushed by Tipnis and others. Now, if you look into coming out of a house, and everyday life would actually come out of the house, come down the street, then go down the narrow lanes, possibly towards the ghat, then have a bath in the ghat, and then come out of the ghat, possibly go into the temple there. Once you've had maybe the ghats are different types, because some ghats are more public, as you can see on the left-hand side, than others. On the right-hand side, you have a very much more private ghat, and those have their different qualities and so on. Now, from the ghat, you might actually do a worship within the ghat area, as on a temple or a little shrine on the left-hand side, or you can go to a temple, or you can go to a temple that is, or a small little shrine within the house. So what is going on here? And also you might actually sit down. Then once you've done your worship and so on, or in the afternoon, you might sit down in the rock and actually have a gossip with others. You might sit down and talk, or you might even prepare before your lunch. You might prepare yourself before you go in for your lunch and so on. So what is happening here is that the public and the private domain that we think are always separated are not actually separated. We frequently push ourselves out into the public domain, or retract, or the public domain can actually come back into the private. So for example, this shrine on the right-hand side, or there are many other shrines like that in Chandernagore, where they are located within a house, so they're private, but at the same time they're public, because people from the neighborhood will come and pay worship over there. So this idea of the penetration of the public into the private, or the private obviously into the public domain, is quite an important part of how we weave our landscape with our activities. So we create, as a result, a cultural landscape. So if you look into the Godolpara area, on this aerial photograph, this whole area begins to then become integrated. The ghats, the river, the ghats, the lanes, the passages at different points in time, the pukur, the pond, that is, the way that they are used by women and, for washing and other things, they begin to become part of, if you like, a spasmodic changing landscape, cultural landscape. And that, I think, is quite important to understand how these buildings and structures and monuments have to be seen in relation to others, in relation to its surroundings. That's quite critical. Another example is here the Nandodol Mandir, for example, that you have a front area which has got people play, but also during the Durga Puja we have a Durga Puja there. At the back there is a pond. Now, aside from the fact that obviously every trace of terracotta decoration has been taken away, barring a few small elements of it, and the kind of whole genealogy of that, from temples to even Islamic burial structures like this one over here, which were all done in this dochala style. We've forgotten everything of that. But also, at the same time, if we do not keep the front field and the back space, including the pond or the pukur at the back of it, on this map here, you see the ground in the front, the pukur in the back. If we do not keep that, then we will lose any trace of its contemporary use, i.e. as a playground, or as a Durga Puja area, or the back of it, which also contains Clive's cannonball mark. Those elements will be completely lost if we begin to obliterate these things. So the idea of a cultural landscape which integrates a range of other areas, both in terms of our activities or through historical actions, would be quite important to keep in mind. So I would very strongly advocate for the cultural landscape. And the cultural landscape, very importantly in Chandernagore, includes these many ponds that we have, pukur, which integrates not only just it's about a way of punctuating the landscape, but it's also an essential part of the natural topography, is a part of our activities and so on, and that needs to be maintained too. So what I've been trying to say up to now is that we need to understand the local heritage in a very complicated it's a complex one, and we have to understand that in its diversity, not to make it oversimplified. We understand where they came from, where it's going. So therefore, that dynamic understanding of it. I was emphasizing this idea of cultural landscapes because the cultural landscape actually integrates a monument within a sphere of activities. And then I think it is very important in understanding the cultural landscape is the notion of community, because we are the people who are actually weaving these aspects together, these spaces together, the temples, the ghats, and everything together. And therefore, the community is sharing this cultural landscape. This shared understanding is quite critical in this particular case. And that is only the thing that will make it a living heritage. Because once heritage is dead, it is dead. There is no real value in dead heritage. The fact that heritage lives and carries on is what matters for us. So in this whole process, and what I'm trying to say is that we need to look into the past, present, and future in a dynamic way. We need to look into environment, society, and economy together. So heritage is not something that is in the past. It has got a tremendous economic value. It has got a tremendous social value and a significant environmental value. And if you look into how they change over a period, we need to begin to understand that it is quite important to not only look into the topography and agricultural structures and urban structures, we need to look into social structures, we need to look into regional hierarchies. How are these networks connected? If you look into the present, we are looking into the built environment, we are looking into the social challenges and the problems. And we are, in this particular case, this was from Oman, we were looking into the crises, and in our case, we are looking into the crisis of employment, the crisis of education, all the kind of things that we need to look into. Now, so the future has to integrate all of this, but also integrate the people. And that's why I'm strongly suggesting a kind of cooperative-based approach, especially where we have shared identities, shared ownership, where cooperatives are probably the only way of going forward. But heritage is an important generator of revenues. It can actually generate a lot of money. And that's one thing that I think we need to be careful about and open about. And we can actually create opportunities for us to become economically more viable. So one of the things that I would ask, as part of this community activity is that to form digital archives, so everyone in the community should be able to contribute to and bring in, whether it's oral histories, whether it's about photographs, whether it's about, artifacts and knowledge about their personal private lives, family lives, and so on, they can begin to form part of a large digital archive so that built heritage and intangible heritage begin to become connected up. And something that we have been planning, we have been doing in the Middle East with the Qatar National Library project that we were doing. But also, in the case of the Hooghly River, where I'm going to talk about a little more about our Archean work, we are trying to build these ideas together into a kind of shared identity. And this is kind of a list of everyone that has been working on our Hooghly River of Cultures project. And finally, just to bring this example of the cooperative and how we should be focusing on the future, I'm just giving you a few slides right at the end, and I know the time is out of prime. I'm going to show you some images of this. Now, this was a hill town, a small hill town in Oman. It's called Misfat Al Green, and it's in the kind of the hills in the center of Oman in the Arabian Peninsula. Oman has got a long cultural history, but over here, this is a small little town, which is an oasis town, which means that it actually relies on a fixed source of water. The surroundings are all quite dry, but you can see the kind of the hill within which it's located. You have this is called a dry, it's like a dry river, but when it rains, it floods, and the water has got humongous strength. But the settlement, therefore, is sort of nestling around it. All this agriculture is steppe agriculture of date palm, and under the date palm grows all kinds of other smaller crops and so on. The tower you see here is actually a Persian tower, which is a pre-Islamic Persian tower. So it was a time when some of the Persian groups were during the Sasanian period the Persians were here. So we are looking at a heritage which is of different types. You know, we have Persian heritage, we have the Arab tribal heritage, we have a range of other agricultural heritage, a water system that is quite ancient, and so on. So this is a kind of aerial view of the settlement from an aerial photograph. You can see the settlement, you know, tumbling down the hill, you know, with bits at the top, bits at the lower end, and so on and so forth. Now, we did a complete documentation, and you can see how complex the sites are, and that we had to document all of those sites. Sometimes we use, of course, we always use measurements, measuring all of these sites physically, but also we use aerial photography, drone photography to bring it together. And it can be done quite easily these days for all kinds of sites. Now, one of the other things that we have been pushing very strongly with the local community is to begin to give them an understanding that heritage management and tourism is very important for their lives, because it can actually give you more revenues, it can give you more resources. So it is both beneficial to locals as well as beneficial to visitors. So we are trying to emphasize that, you know, this is a sort of give and take relationship, because like many communities, and I know that even in Chandernagore, there is a lot of you know, sort of reticence towards allowing tourism into one's own house. But one of the things that one has to understand is that it is a give and take relationship through which everyone can enrich themselves. So that was one of the big work that we were doing, is trying to push the local community to understand this. So not only that it was going to give back to the locals some money and also know-how, it was also going to give the visitors a lot of you know, resources. But it was also going to help the local farming and community. It was also going to help the local people in the settlements. So accordingly, one of the things that we developed was a cooperative structure. Now, they had a small company that we pushed with the government and liaised with the government. We were sort of like a bridge between the local community and the government to establish a cooperative. So what started off originally as a 5-member significant achievements, now pretty much everyone in the community is keen to be part of it. The reason being that if you are in a cooperative, whatever comes in as revenues to the cooperative is shared by the cooperative members. So therefore, even if it's a small share, rather than keeping your house unusable and letting it rot, you are actually getting some money out of it. So that is the key idea, the very basic, you know, economic idea. And then that begins to develop social cohesion. So previously there were quite a lot of fragments. People didn't want to talk to each other because some were in favor of tourism, others were not. Now there is a much closer community. Now the other thing that was happening is that, you know, everyone now is beginning to contribute to it. So one family is making the breakfast for the, you know, people who are staying there in a short stay accommodation. Another family is making the dinner, and so on and so forth. So that is quite a good thing. So talking to the local groups, talking very closely to them, working with them very closely, we developed a master plan about how to do, what to do with it. Certain places were important, so we are studying that anthropologically as well as physically to understand their values. And therefore that creates a master plan of what to do first, what to do next, and so on. Now, we also, let's not forget that sustainability is a very important thing. So how do we reuse the waste? There's so much waste being generated by agriculture, by our household use and everything. How do you make use of that? And how do we reuse that? So we were putting in several proposals which will actually make these heritage tourism proposals come off-grid. That is that we will not be using the government electricity and water, but we will be using the local electricity that is generated. So we calculated how much water, how much electricity will be necessary, how can we store it, like battery storage systems, who will support all of this, and so on. And then also biogas and, you know, little turbines in the water systems so that we can generate electricity, the micro turbines. So all these kind of ideas that will begin to eventually make a really valuable contribution. And what we also did is that we costed it out economically. So everything was costed out. How much will this cost? How much will this? So there is both the cost of all the kind of components that we're trying to generate. If I have to revive a house, how much is that going to cost? If I've got to put in electricity, how much is that going to cost? But also, what are the opportunities, financial opportunities? So how much is it going to bring in if I do this facility, or if I open a shop like this? Those kind of things then were also extended with a very close engagement with the local community. Children were involved in proposing design and detailed, suggestions of what can be done on various sites. At the same time, we went out to work with local banks because we wanted to, because the government could not fund this one, and as is the reality today, that it is impossible for governments to fund heritage revival. So here we looked at bank, and through their corporate social responsibility scheme, how we can actually develop some part of it. So we developed a phase one. And for the phase one, we went out to the local community and said, what can we do with these places? So we had these workshops with local kids, as you can see, and they produced a lot of proposals. Now, here, I'm just coming to before the last 2-3 slides, I'm just talking about one particular thing. That is, how do we approach this? If you remember that at the beginning, I was talking in Bengali, and I talked about how we should be, while we should be conserving, at the same time, we should be changing our environments. Now, this particular one, which we know very well, Juraghat, where this particular canopy was rebuilt. But the sad thing is that it was rebuilt in concrete. Now I can understand why it was rebuilt in concrete. Possibly it will, last longer. But actually, these are the kind of monuments which might actually be worth rebuilding in the conservative manner. That is, following tradition that used to exist. And I'm fully understanding of why this was done in the way, but at the same time, it is probably not the right approach that one would take. On the other hand, less important structures does not need to necessarily be rebuilt or conserved exactly like that, because our lives change. And I think this is one example of, you can see how materials can actually come together. You have brickwork, you've got stone, and then you've got the new concrete, framing all of that and keeping it together. Now, I think that it is very important that this kind of approach of what we call adaptive reuse is done very carefully. Another example from a site, which is quite interesting, where, most of it is kept as it is, but you can actually see that where it comes to this arch and creating a new door has been created, keeping very clear what is new and what is old. Okay, the floor is created, and the manner in which the floor has been created is slightly different from the rest of it. So it is very clear what is new and what is old. Same thing happens here on the left-hand side. You can see how new render can be separated from old things. And that, I think, is a very important approach that we can take. But we can take sensitively when we are developing and conserving our houses. So it is not about doing it exactly as it used to be in the old times, but being sensitive how we actually change it. But that's something that we don't do. And this is the kind of thing that we brought to Miswat, that village in Oman, where we have now built a range of facilities, taking some of these older houses and converting those to this Bank of Muscat corporate social responsibility funding, where we brought in new things. You can see that the old structure is retained, whereas a lot of new elements, those which are new elements, are clearly new elements. So there is a concrete staircase, which is as simple as a polished concrete staircase, bits of new balustrades and so on. They're not the same as the old ones. And we are beginning to bring a character so that, even the rock face here, which is all of this is rock, by putting this shade on top and by throwing the shadow against the rock, it begins to bring the rock, make the rock alive. So therefore, what was previously unnoticed is now beginning to become noticed. Same thing we're doing in this kind of community civic space, which there was what you call a tanur, which is a roasting pit that they use during the Eid festivals. And then there was a bread making place here. And we wanted to convert this one into a bigger training center, which is what we did. But if you look into it, we still retain the older structures, but the staircase is recognizable to the one that we have done for the visitor center at the first slide that I showed you. But the rest are very different. So there is wider common language. We are also using a kind of mixture of new and old. And the new is in contrast to the old. Same thing happens here. And this restaurant has now opened with a lot of publicity now. This is a restaurant that we created. And you can see here that new elements have been used, but at the same time, older elements and natural elements have been retained. So these chains are actually to bring the water down from the rooftop and down here, so that when it rains, you can actually get the water drained out, but also it can begin to create a kind of landscape within the building. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is, just coming to the end of this, is that first of all, we need to understand heritage in terms of its complexity, and we need to bring mobilize the community to begin to contribute to the richness and to begin to build up a repository, like a digital archive, if you like, of the diversity and complexity of these cultural heritage that we have. We need to understand and study how this changed over a period of time. We need to understand also how the cultural landscape formed, what are the ingredients of it, and we should not take a monument-specific approach, that we should take this cultural landscape-specific approach, where a larger area is considered as part of the cultural heritage. We need to involve the community at many levels. I talked about the digital archiving and the kind of almost a crowdsourcing of information, but at the same time, we need to involve the community in shared heritage. And I think the very important part of it is that we could, in a case like Chandernagore, we can progress with cooperative-led approaches to heritage management. And that then also shares the cost, shares the revenues, as we generate the revenues. And interpretation has to be inclusive, so that it's not about one culture, it's about many, many cultures. Sometimes these cultures are conflicting. And therefore, when we're talking about new use, we're actually moving the heritage forward. So I'm making the case that while certain specific important heritage has to be restored and conserved in following a manner in which they were originally constructed, domestic heritage, on the other hand, could actually be reused adaptively, using new materials, new spaces, new meaning, new program, and that can be done very sensitively. And that's where architects and planners and also stakeholders come in together, because it's very important that architects do this sensitively, planners do it sensitively, and also planners' role in maintaining the cultural landscape, as that I mentioned, was quite crucial too. So that's where I'll end. I hope this has been of some value, and I'll be very happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bandyopadhyay. I'm getting an echo. Professor Bandyopadhyay, yes, it is all right if you could mute your mic. So yes, thank you so much for this lecture, and we have been. You were showing this gallery of volunteers who worked for this Hooghly River of Cultures project, and while working for this Hooghly River of Cultures project, in which you were also a crucial contributor, a very important contributor, we have already thought again and again about this cooperative approach among the stakeholders of the heritage households, and we have also seen that building, rebuilding, or reconstructing a house in the old way often costs a lot. So if it has to be sustainable, both for the heritage building and both for the family, the stakeholder of the heritage building, there has to be some kind of a mixture. একটা একটা কোথাও একটা গিয়ে মাঝামাঝি জায়গায় আমাদেরকে দাঁড়াতে হবে, যেখানে আমরা ডেফিনেটলি আমরা মানে অ্যাপিয়ারেন্সটা, প্ল্যানটা যত সম্ভব পুরনো রাখতে চেষ্টা করব। আমরা দেখেছি শ্রীরামপুরের যেখানে সরকারি উদ্যোগে এবং ডেনমার্কের উদ্যোগে যেখানে কাজ হয়েছে, ভীষণ সুন্দর কাজ হয়েছে, কিন্তু সেই কাজের যে খরচা সেটা একজন বাড়িতে যখন করতে যায় তার পক্ষে প্রায় সেটা একটা অসম্ভব একটা বাজেটে গিয়ে দাঁড়ায়। বিশেষত একটা বাড়িতে যখন অনেকগুলো মালিক, বাড়ির মালিক অনেকগুলো হয়ে গেছে, এইরকম একটা পরিস্থিতিতে এসে দাঁড়িয়েছে, সেটা আপনি উল্লেখ করেছেন, সেটা খুবই উল্লেখযোগ্য। আচ্ছা, আমি এখন বেশ কয়েকটা বিষয় ইন্টারাকশনের জন্য আমি আপনার সাথে আলোচনা করতে চাই। এখানে আমাদের কমেন্ট গুলো আপনিও ওখানে দেখতে পারবেন। শাকনিক ব্যানার্জি বলছে যে most domestic buildings from the colonial era Bengal and the Hooghly region in particular bear traces of syncretic influences, both Indian and European. My question is, how far can they be related to the cultural landscape borne by everyday interactions between Indians and Europeans? এরপরে ওর শাগনিক ব্যানার্জির আরেকটি কমেন্ট আছে, এটাতে আপনার কি বক্তব্য একটু শুনে নি, তারপরে আবার বলছি।
ওকে, নিশ্চয়ই এটা প্রশ্নগুলো সবই খুব জরুরি এবং প্রয়োজনীয় এবং রেলেভেন্ট। syncretic influences, yes, there have been, that's what I was trying to show, that the syncretic influences are at different levels. So what I was showing is that sometimes it was important for them to show those influences, the Western influences, on a Bengali bari, because it was important to show that I'm part of this wider culture. In other cases, there was a deeper subscription to that culture, এবং সেই ক্ষেত্রে যেটা হয়েছে যে বিল্ডিং এর স্পেস প্ল্যান পাল্টেছে। যেমন আমি লালবাগানের বাড়িগুলো দেখাচ্ছিলাম, যে বাঙালি বাড়ির যে স্পেস প্ল্যান, যেটা আমাদের উঠোন থেকে শুরু হয়েছিল, সেই স্পেস প্ল্যানের সঙ্গে কখনো কোনো জিনিস অ্যাড করা হচ্ছে, কোনো জিনিস তারপরেতে তার সঙ্গে সেটাকে আরো বেশি শক্ত করে দাঁড় করানো হচ্ছে, যখন আমরা একটা পুরো প্ল্যান পাচ্ছি, একটা পুরো বিল্ডিং পাচ্ছি যেটা ওয়েস্টার্ন স্টাইল। নাও এই জিনিসটাতে প্রত্যেকটা স্টেজে কিন্তু আমাদের কালচারাল অ্যাকসেপ্টেন্স ডিফারেন্ট, কালচারাল সাবস্ক্রিপশন ডিফারেন্ট। আমরা কোন কালচার বা কোন ক্লাবে বিলং করছি সেই আইডিয়াটা কিন্তু প্রত্যেক ক্ষেত্রে ডিফারেন্ট। এবং এই জিনিসটা আমার মনে হয় সবচেয়ে বড় কথা, আমাদের যেটা একটা জিনিস বলতে চাইছিলাম, যে ধরুন আমরা ঐতিহ্যকে, বেশিরভাগ হেরিটেজকে আমরা ফ্যাসাড দিয়ে দেখি, চোখে যেটা দেখতে পাই সেটাই দেখি। যে জিনিসটা আমরা দেখতে পাই না সেটা হচ্ছে স্পেস। এবং আমরা যদি স্পেশিয়াল অর্গানাইজেশন, স্পেস অর্গানাইজেশন বাড়িগুলোর দেখি, তাহলে কিন্তু আমরা অনেক বেশি এই সিনক্রেটিজমটা, যেটা আপনি শাগনিক আপনি বলছেন, which is absolutely right, সেটাকে আমরা বেটার বুঝতে পারবো। এবং সেটা যদি আমরা বুঝতে পারি, সেই কালচারাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপের মধ্যে এই যে জিনিসগুলোর যে একটা যেটা ফেসাডে আছে, সেটা যদি একটা রেন্ডারিং হয়, একটা যদি স্টাকো ওয়ার্ক হয়, প্লাস্টারিং এর কাজ হয়, সেটার যা ভ্যালু এবং একটা স্পেসের যা ভ্যালু সেটা ডিফারেন্ট। এবং সেটা যেটা প্রজেক্ট করছে, কখনো বলছে দেখো আমি এখানে দাঁড়িয়ে আছি, কখনো সেটা বলছে না এটা আমার জীবনের অঙ্গ। এই দুটোর মধ্যে ডিফারেন্স আছে। অতএব এই জিনিসগুলোকে যদি আমরা বুঝি, তাহলে আমরা বুঝতে পারবো যে কালচার ল্যান্ডস্কেপের হায়ারার্কিটা কোথায়, যে কোনটা কতটা এক্সটেন্ড করছে, কতটা এটার পার্ট বা না।
হ্যাঁ, এক্স্যাক্টলি। এই কালচারাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপে যে হায়ারার্কি কথাটা, এখান থেকেই আমি আসি। সাগ্নিক রক নিয়ে এবং কোর্টইয়ার্ড নিয়ে আরেকটা কথা বলছে। ও বলছে যে দীপেশ চক্রবর্তী in his essay on garbage modernity and India speaks of how the Europeans in colonial Bengal generally were confused about the permeability of the private and the public space in everyday spaces that the Indians inhabited. How far do you think that the rock or the courtyard as more secular public spaces within the domestic household serve to facilitate the confusion, so to speak? I mean, সেই হায়ারার্কি কথাটাতেই আমরা হয়তো আসছি, যে হায়ারার্কিটাতে একটা মানে একটা কনফিউশন ক্রিয়েট হচ্ছে সবসময়। হায়ারার্কিটা যে ওয়াটার টাইট বাউন্ডারিতে থাকছে এমনটাও নয়।
নিশ্চয়ই, অ্যাবসলিউটলি রামানুজ, তুমি ঠিক কথা বলেছো যেটা, এবং সাগ্নিক অ্যাবসলিউটলি আই এগ্রি যে ইট ইজ সবচেয়ে যে জিনিসটা আমি বলতে চাইছিলাম যে সময়ে, ধরুন সকালে আমরা যে কাজটা করছি, বিকেলে আমরা অন্য কাজ করছি, তো স্পেসের ডেফিনেশন কিন্তু কখনোই একরকম থেকে যাচ্ছে না। যে জিনিসটা প্রাইভেট বিকেলে, সেই জিনিসটা কিন্তু সকালের দিকে হয়তো অনেক বেশি পাবলিক, কারণ অনেক লোকে হয়তো আসছে, বাড়ির কাজের লোক আসছে, বাড়ির থেকে বাইরে আমাদের ট্রেডিশনাল বাড়িগুলোতে হয়তো অনেক সময় অনেক বাগানের কাজের লোক আসছে, তারা এসে হয়তো জিনিসপত্র নিয়ে যাচ্ছে, খাবার খেতে আসছে। এই যে ইন্টারাকশন গুলো হচ্ছে, তাতে কিন্তু এই উঠোন কিন্তু পাবলিক হয়ে যাচ্ছে কিছু সময়, বা মাছওয়ালা আসছে, বাজারের লোক আসছে, এই যে জিনিসগুলো হচ্ছে, এটাতে পাবলিসিটি এবং প্রাইভেসি কিন্তু প্রতি মুহূর্তে চেঞ্জ করছে, এবং সময়ের সঙ্গে সঙ্গে এবং বিভিন্ন বছরে বিভিন্ন সময়ের সঙ্গে সঙ্গে এইগুলো আমাদের পালা পার্বণ সব মিলে এইগুলো কিন্তু খুব স্প্যাজমোডিক ছিল। এই জিনিসটা কিন্তু আমাদের অনেক সময়, যেটা এখন ওয়েস্টার্ন আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং অনেক বেটার হয়েছে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে পাবলিক এবং প্রাইভেট স্পেস যে ফিক্স নয়, সেই আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিংটা এখন অনেক বেটার। কিন্তু আমাদের ক্ষেত্রে যেটা আমরা আমাদের নিজেদের পায়ে নিজেদের কুড়ুল মেরেছি, যে আমরা নিজেদের আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিংটাকে কিন্তু কখনোই আমরা বাইরে বার করিনি, বা আমরা সেই যে আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিংটা, যে ফাইন গ্রেন আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং, যেটা সূক্ষ্মতাটা থাকা দরকার, সেটা আমরা কিন্তু কখনোই আমাদের শিক্ষায় আনিনি। এবং যার ফলে কোনো একজন আর্কিটেক্ট হচ্ছে, বা কোনো একজন প্ল্যানার হচ্ছে, বা কোনো একজন জিওগ্রাফার হচ্ছে, তাদের কিন্তু সেই স্ট্যাটিক আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিংটা থেকে যাচ্ছে। এবং সেই জন্য আমি যেটা বারবার বলতে চাইছিলাম, যে এই যে ডাইনামিক অ্যাসপেক্ট অফ স্পেস আনফোল্ডস, যে স্পেসটা দিনের বেলা প্রচন্ড পাবলিক, সেই স্পেসটাই কিন্তু রাত্রে অনেক প্রাইভেট হয়ে যেতে পারে, এবং সেটা পাবলিক স্পেসের ক্ষেত্রেও প্রযোজ্য। এই জিনিসটা কিন্তু আমাদের, এবং রক বা উঠোনের যে অ্যাক্টিভিটি গুলো আছে বিকেলে, যেমন ধরুন অনেক পাড়ার বাচ্চারা বা ইয়াং ছেলেপেলেরা এসে রকে বসে, সেটা কিন্তু সেই সময়টা কিন্তু বয়স্করা বসছে না। সো এই যে লেভেল অফ পাবলিসিটি, এগেন ইট ভ্যারিজ অ্যাজ ওয়েল।
হ্যাঁ, আমরা চন্দননগরের এই হেরিটেজ হাউসহোল্ড গুলোতে কাজ করতে গিয়েও আমার একটা অভিজ্ঞতা হয়েছে। সেটা হচ্ছে যে কয়েকটা বাড়ি আমি দেখেছি যেগুলোতে মাল্টিপল কোর্টইয়ার্ডস আছে। মানে প্রথম কোর্টইয়ার্ডটা ঠাকুর দালান, ভেতরের কোর্টইয়ার্ডে কিন্তু কোনো ঠাকুর দালান নয়, সেটা আরেকটু ছোট কোর্টইয়ার্ড হতে পারে, কিন্তু সেই কোর্টইয়ার্ডটা বা সেই উঠোনটাতে শুধু ঘরের মহিলারা, ঘরের অন্দরমহলের লোকজনেরাই যাতায়াত করে। এবং কথা বলে যেটা জানতে পারা গেছে যে প্রথমেই যখন বাড়ি তৈরি হয়েছিল তখন কিন্তু 3টে কোর্টইয়ার্ড ওলা অত বড় বাড়ি তৈরি হয়নি। অর্থাৎ প্রথম দিকে যে অংশটা প্রাইভেট ছিল, পরে পিছনের দিকে আরেকটা বাড়ি তৈরি করার পরে সামনের অংশটা পাবলিক হয়ে গেছে, পিছনের কোর্টইয়ার্ডটা দেখা গেছে যে তখন প্রাইভেট হয়ে গেছে। এইরকম ভাবেও কিন্তু চেঞ্জেস গুলো হয়েছে। এবং এই ধরনের যে বাড়িগুলো, যখন যারা যত বেশি বিত্তবান হয়েছেন তখন তারা হয়তো আরেকটু বাড়ির সঙ্গে অ্যাড অন করেছেন, এবং অ্যাড অন করতে গিয়ে আপনি দেখিয়েছেন স্লিপি হলোতে কিভাবে একটা ইউরোপিয়ান স্টাইলে সামনের যে ফাসাদটা সেটাকে কনস্ট্রাক্ট করা হয়েছে। এইরকমই একটা প্রশ্ন আমাদের ইনটেকের সদস্য ডক্টর বাসুদেব মালিক জিজ্ঞেস করছেন যে would you kindly specifically indicate the important French architectural features on the buildings of Chandernagore?
বাসুদেববাবু ধন্যবাদ। আমার মনে হয় যে এই ক্ষেত্রে যেটা আমি বলতেও চাইছিলাম পুরো লেকচার থ্রু দিয়ে, যে it will be very difficult to say this is a French element, or this is an Indian element, or this is a European element, কারণ আমরা যেভাবে যে ফিল্টারের থ্রু দিয়ে এগুলোকে আমরা নিয়েছি সেটা আমাদের নিজস্ব, এবং সেটা খুব ইন্ডিয়ান, সেটা খুব বাঙালি, এবং তার মধ্যে দিয়ে যে ডিপেন্ডিং অন যেভাবে আমাদের অ্যাক্সেস টু ওয়াইডার ওয়ার্ল্ড কালচার আছে, প্রত্যেকটা ফ্যামিলি প্রত্যেকটা গ্রুপের মধ্যে সেটা বিভিন্নভাবে এসেছে, বিভিন্ন চ্যানেলের থ্রু দিয়ে এসেছে। কেউ ব্যবসার মধ্যে দিয়ে এনেছে, কেউ পড়াশোনার মধ্যে দিয়ে এনেছে, কেউ প্রফেশনাল লাইফের মধ্যে দিয়ে এনেছে। এদের প্রত্যেকটার ইন্টারপ্রিটেশন কিন্তু ডিফারেন্ট, যার ফলে আমরা যে এলিমেন্টগুলোকে দেখে বলছি যে এগুলো ফ্রেঞ্চ, মেবি ভেরি কেয়ারফুলি দেখলে আমাদের মনে হবে যে সেগুলো কিন্তু খুব ফ্রেঞ্চ নয়। এবং তার মধ্যে আমরা নিজেদের এই যে করিন্থিয়ান কলমের ইন্ট্রোডাকশন, এটা তো ফ্রেঞ্চ নয়, এটা তো আপনার গ্রিক রোমান টাইম থেকে চলে এসছে, গ্রিক টাইম থেকে চলে এসছে, কিন্তু করিন্থিয়ান কলমের যে এলিমেন্টস গুলো সেগুলো কিন্তু গ্রিক বা রোমান নয় এক্ষেত্রে, এবং তার মধ্যে আমাদের নিজেদের এডিশন আছে। তো এই যে জিনিসটা, এবং সেটার জন্য যে আমাদের অনেকটা বেশি অ্যানালিসিসের প্রয়োজন, গবেষণার প্রয়োজন এবং ইন্টারপ্রিটেশনের প্রয়োজন, সেইটার কথা আমি বলতে চাইছিলাম যে I don't think that there is anything overtly specifically French, কিন্তু আর সেই কারণে আমার মনে হয় যে আমার সবচেয়ে বড় কথা মনে হচ্ছে যে এই যে টিপনেসের যে which is very good, যেটা প্রচুর কাজ হয়েছে এবং খুব ভালো কাজ, কিন্তু সেটাকে আরো দূরে নিয়ে যাওয়া প্রয়োজন। সেটা হচ্ছে যে এইগুলোকে যদি আমরা ফ্রেঞ্চ বা ইন্ডো ফ্রেঞ্চ বলে চালাই, তাহলে কিন্তু আমাদের এই কমপ্লেক্সিটিটার অধিকাংশটাই হারিয়ে যাচ্ছে এই বড় বড় ব্যানারের নিচে। এবং সেই জন্য আমার মনে হয় যে আমরা আসলে কোন পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে নিয়েছি সেটা আমাদের দেখতে হবে। এবং বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রে আমার মনে হয় যে বাঙালি কালচার, যেমন উঠোনের অর্গানাইজেশনটা, আমার মনে হচ্ছে চন্দননগরে বেশিরভাগ বাড়ির মধ্যে কিন্তু একটা বাঙালি বাড়ি আছে, এবং সেটা কিন্তু ইজ নট ভেরি ডিফারেন্ট ফ্রম ওয়েন various people came from other parts of in Bengal to go into Kolkata. কলকাতার বাড়ির যে উঠানের আঙ্গিক, সেটার সঙ্গে এটারও অনেক সামঞ্জস্য আছে, সিমিলারিটি আছে, কিন্তু তার সঙ্গে সঙ্গে কিন্তু আমরা কিছু কিছু ডিফারেন্ট জিনিস নিয়ে আসছি এখানে, এবং সেগুলো ফ্যামিলি স্পেসিফিক, যেটা বলছিলাম যে সেই ডিফারেন্স গুলো থেকে আসছে। অতএব এই যে বাঙালি পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে নেওয়া, কোন জায়গা থেকে এসেছে সেই পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে নেওয়া, তাদের ম্যারেজ হিস্ট্রি কি ছিল, কানেকশনস কি হয়েছে, সেগুলো থেকে I think we need to understand how these influences have come in. Okay.
আচ্ছা, থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ। এখানে আরেকজন রাজীব বাবু একজন, তিনি সম্ভবত আপনার আগের পরিচিত, তিনি আপনাকে হ্যালো বলেছেন এবং বলেছেন যে দিস ইজ রাজীব, উইকিপিডিয়ান, আই এম ইন্টারেস্টেড টু ডিজিটালি আর্কাইভ দ্য হেরিটেজ অফ চন্দননগর অন উইকিপিডিয়া। এটা আমার মনে হয়েছে খুব ভালো একটা প্রপোজাল, এবং তিনি তার ইমেল আপনার সঙ্গে শেয়ার করেছেন। আপনি চ্যাট বক্সে গেলে দেখতেও পাবেন, আমি সেটা রিড আউট করছি না। রাজীব বাবুকে বলবো যে আপনি যদি সৌমেন বাবুর সাথে কন্ট্যাক্ট করতে চান, ওনার ইউনিভার্সিটি প্রোফাইলে ওখানে ইমেল আছে।
হ্যাঁ, নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই, কারণ আমার ফর সাম রিজন রামানুজ, আমার চ্যাট গুলো কিন্তু চ্যাটে সাগনিকের 3টে এবং রাজীবের ভেরি ইনফরমেটিভ অবধি এসেছে, 3টে অবধি, তারপর থেকে আর কিছু আসেনি ফর সাম রিজন। তো ইট উইল বি গুড যদি যে কেউ যদি আমার সঙ্গে ডাইরেক্টলি কন্ট্যাক্ট করতে চান, আমার লিভারপুল ইউনিভার্সিটির অ্যাড্রেসে, এটা হচ্ছে সৌমেন বি, SOUMYEN, আমি জফলা ব্যবহার করি, SOUMYEN B, সৌমেন বি @liverpool.ac.uk। তো এটাই যদি আমায় কন্ট্যাক্ট করেন তাহলে আমি ডেফিনেটলি উত্তর দেবো, এবং আমার মনে হয় যে এগুলো আমাদের এগিয়ে নিয়ে যাওয়া প্রয়োজন। রাজীব বাবু, থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ, কারণ আমার মনে হয় যে একটা কালেকটিভ এফোর্টের প্রয়োজন আছে, এবং এখানে এই যে উইকিপিডিয়া বেসড ওয়ার্ক, এটা খুব জরুরি, এবং এই জন্যই আমি বলছিলাম যে ক্রাউড সাপোর্টেড, ক্রাউড ফান্ডেড অ্যাপ্রোচটা কিন্তু খুব প্রয়োজন, যেটা এখন ইউরোপে বিভিন্ন জায়গাতে হচ্ছে, আমাদেরও করা প্রয়োজন, কারণ এছাড়া কিন্তু কোনো উপায় নেই। আর একটা জিনিস হচ্ছে যে আমরা প্রফেশনালি আমি আর্কিটেক্ট হিসেবে বলছি, কিন্তু আমি প্ল্যানার হিসেবে বা আরবান ডিজাইনার হিসেবে বলবো, জিওগ্রাফার হিসেবে, হিস্টোরিয়ান হিসেবে আমরা কিভাবে হেল্প করব আমাদের ফ্যামিলিগুলোকে, আমাদের বিভিন্ন স্টেক হোল্ডারগুলোকে। আমার মনে হয় যে এই ক্ষেত্রে একটা যে যে অ্যাপ্রোচ হওয়া দরকার, যে এটা আমাদের ইট শুড বি এ ভলেন্টারি অ্যাপ্রোচ। আর্কিটেক্ট বা প্ল্যানার বা হিস্টোরিয়ান বা রিসার্চার voluntarily should contribute to these conditions, কারণ we are very well aware যে how little resources people have. And also it is very important because unless you provide voluntary support, these sensitive approaches will never happen, because no one will be able to do that with a builder. A contractor will say, well, আপনি এটা এখানে এরকম করে দিন, আমি তো বলছি এটা হয়ে যাবে। কিন্তু আমাদের যে রোলটা as a more informed stakeholder, সেই রোলটা কিন্তু প্রয়োজন, এবং সেটা একমাত্র ভলেন্টারি হিসেবে আসতে পারে এই ক্ষেত্রে।
হ্যাঁ, আমাদের ইন্টারঅ্যাক্টিভ সেশনে মোটামুটি যেগুলো আমরা প্রশ্ন পেয়েছিলাম সেগুলো আলোচনা করলাম। আমাদের হাতে এখনো 15 মিনিট মতো সময় আছে, 10-12 মিনিট অ্যাকচুয়ালি। তো আমি অনুরোধ করব যে এখানে আমাদের সঙ্গে আহ, 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 অনেকে আছেন যারা হয়তো অনেক কিছু আলোচনা করতে চান, যাদের সাথে আমাদের যখন সামনাসামনি দেখা হয়েছে চন্দননগর নিয়ে তারা ভাবনা চিন্তা করছেন। May I now request everyone to put their mic on, and if they want to interact with Professor Bandyopadhyay, please put your mic on, and you can now interact with our speaker.
আচ্ছা রামানুজ, আমি বলছি বাসুদেব হালদার।
হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ, আমার যেটা প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে যে আমরা এখানে চন্দননগরে একদম জন্মে থেকেই রয়েছি। তো ইদানিং যেটা আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমাদের কতগুলো যেমন আমরা আইডেন্টিটি বলি, সেই রকম কিছু আমাদের আইডেন্টিটি ছিল, যে এই জায়গায় এইরকম একটা বাড়ি আছে বা এই জায়গায় এরকম একটা কিছু জিনিস রয়েছে, যেটা একটা ট্র্যাডিশনালি দেখে আসছি। কিন্তু এখন দেখা যাচ্ছে এই যে সৌমেনদা যে কথাগুলো বলছেন, এই ভ্যালু গুলো তো আস্তে আস্তে আমরা হারিয়ে ফেলছি, এবং যে কারণে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে মূলত হার্ডকোর এরিয়া যেগুলো টাউনের রয়েছে সেই জায়গাতে হেরিটেজ তো দূরের কথা, মানে সে বিল্ডিং গুলোই ভ্যানিশ হয়ে যাচ্ছে পুরোটা। এবং তুলনামূলকভাবে একটু ভেতরের দিকে হলে তাও বা সেটা থাকছে, কিন্তু ইদানিং সেটাও চলে যাচ্ছে আস্তে আস্তে। তো আমরা মানে মানুষের মনের ভেতরে কিভাবে এই সেন্সটাকে একটু দিতে পারি যে অ্যাটলিস্ট সবই যদি না ফ্ল্যাট হয়ে যায়, কিছু তো অন্তত থাকুক। এটার কি কোনো রকম কোনো প্রচেষ্টা বা কিছু কি ভাবা যেতে পারে?
হ্যাঁ, ধন্যবাদ
আচ্ছা,
বাসুদেব বাবু।
হ্যাঁ
না, এটা খুবই প্রয়োজনীয় কথা, এবং আমার মনে হয় যে এই যে পাবলিক অ্যাওয়ারনেসটা, এটা বাড়ানোটা, আমি বলছি না আমার কাছে কোনো একটা সলিউশন আছে এটা, কিন্তু আমার মনে হয় যে পাবলিক অ্যাওয়ারনেসটা বাড়ানো প্লাস এক্সাম্পল দিয়ে দেখানো যে কি হতে পারে। কারণ আমাদের বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রে কিন্তু আর একটা প্রবলেম হচ্ছে যে আমরা কিন্তু আমাদের সামনে কোনো এক্সাম্পল নেই বা বিভিন্ন সময় থাকে না। অতএব ফ্ল্যাট বানানোর সময় কিন্তু আমরা একমাত্র দেখছি যে ডেভেলপার বা বিল্ডার কি বলছে, কিন্তু ফ্ল্যাট বানানোর সঙ্গে সঙ্গে বা পাশের জমিটা ব্যবহার করার যে অন্যান্য উপায় থাকতে পারে, এবং তাতে হয়তো একেবারে এক্স্যাক্টলি ওই পয়সা না পেলেও আমরা কিন্তু ভালোভাবে রিসোর্স ডেভেলপ করতে পারি, সেই জিনিসটার কিন্তু কোনো এক্সাম্পল আমাদের কাছে দিতে পারছি না, আমরা দিতে পারছি না ওদের। এবং যার ফলে যেটা হচ্ছে যে বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রে, এবং এটা আমাদের প্রফেশনালদের প্রবলেম, এবং প্রফেশনাল বলতে আমি শুধু আর্কিটেক্ট বলছি না, আর্কিটেক্ট, প্ল্যানার, হিস্টোরিয়ান, কালচারাল স্পেশালিস্ট, জিওগ্রাফার, সবার কথা বলছি যে আমরা কিন্তু সেই আইডিয়াটা দিতে পারছি না, ইকোনমিস্ট সেই আইডিয়াতে দিতে পারছি না, এবং ইকোনমিক মডেল অল্টারনেটিভ নেই বলে আমরা সামনে আমাদের এই জিনিসগুলো নষ্ট হয়ে যাচ্ছে। আমি বলছি না যে সবকিছুকে বাঁচানো যাবে, অসম্ভব সেটা নয়, এবং সেটা সারা পৃথিবীতেই তাই হচ্ছে, কিন্তু যদি যথাযথ অ্যাওয়ারনেস তৈরি করা যায় তাহলে আমার তো মনে হয় যে অনেক বেশি রাখা যেতে পারে। এবং তার জন্য আমাদের এই ভলেন্টারি গ্রুপিং এর প্রচন্ড প্রয়োজন, এবং কিভাবে বলা হচ্ছে এবং সবাইকে, এবং এই যে শেয়ার্ড কালচারাল আইডেন্টিটির কথা আমরা যেটা বলছি, যে এটার মধ্যে কিন্তু শুধু আমার নয়, আপনার নয়, এরা সবার আইডেন্টিটি জড়িত রয়েছে, সেই জিনিসটাকে তুলে ধরাটা খুব প্রয়োজন। এই আমার তো মনে হয় যে এই দুটো জিনিস, একটা হচ্ছে অ্যাওয়ারনেস, একটা হচ্ছে যে রেগুলার কমিউনিকেশন, বলা যে কেন করছি, এটার সুবিধে কি কি হতে পারে, ইকোনমিক, স্পেশালি ইকোনমিক। কারণ আমার মনে হয় যে আমরা বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রে আমাদের যা ইকোনমিক অবস্থা আমাদের দেশে বা বাংলাদেশে এবং চন্দ্রনগরে বিশেষত, সেখানে আমরা যদি ইকোনমিক আর্গুমেন্টটাকে না ডেভেলপ করতে পারি বিভিন্নভাবে, তাহলে কিন্তু আমরা হেরে যাবই। এবং সেই জন্য ইকোনমিক আর্গুমেন্টটা স্পেসিফিক্যালি চন্দ্রনগর বা এই ধরনের অঞ্চলে কিভাবে বাড়ানো যায় সেটা আমাদের দেখতে হবে, এবং সেটা যতক্ষণ না আর্গুমেন্টগুলো আগে তৈরি করতে পারছি, ততক্ষণ আমরা কিন্তু এগিয়ে গিয়ে কাউকে বললে কোনো ফল হবে না। অতএব আমার মনে হয় যে ইকোনমিক আর্গুমেন্টটাকে খুব দৃঢ়ভাবে গড়ে তুলতে হবে, এবং সেটা করতে গেলে আমাদের বিভিন্ন জিনিস কিভাবে একটা ইকোনমিক, একটা রেভিনিউ জেনারেশন হতে পারে, তার পুরো পিকচারটা আমাদের ডেভেলপ করতে হবে। সেটা কিন্তু এগেন আমার মনে হয় যে প্রফেশনালদের we have to form a voluntary sector. We have to form a collective which will not look at our own personal gains, but will develop something which will be for the gain of stakeholders, wider stakeholders. We have to develop models, we have to develop alternatives. Alternative না থাকলে কিন্তু আমরা হেরে যাবই। সেই জন্য আমার মনে হয় যে এই জিনিসটাকে যদি আমরা দাঁড় করাতে পারি, এবং তখন ডেভেলপারদের সঙ্গেও একটা ডায়ালগ তৈরি করতে হবে, কারণ আনলেস দেয়ার ওয়ান ওভার, যে তার মধ্যেও তার ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল বেনিফিট আছে, তাহলে কিন্তু এই জিনিসটা আবার ঘটবে না। অতএব আমার মনে হয় এই জিনিসগুলো একটু আমার মনে হয় যে দেখা প্রয়োজন।
ধন্যবাদ সোমেনদা।
আচ্ছা, Professor UK Bandyopadhyay deserves to know whether there is any can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Whether there is any one specific proposal on making a cooperative system, a structure on this, and also any thought on making digital archive.
There isn't as yet a specific proposal, but as you know that through the Hooghly River of Cultures project, we have been we are trying to develop, through a voluntary approach, we are trying to develop an awareness. And Ian Magadera, who's been leading the project, has been doing a lot of good work in that direction. Ramanuj and everyone else in the INTACH and in Chandernagore have been doing that. I think we can organize that better. We can under the INTACH, and through the INTACH, which will be fantastic. So we can begin to develop the approaches, professional approaches through the INTACH. At the same time, there is again no approach at this moment, and I would be very keen to know whether we can develop a sort of digital archive approach. And I will be from Liverpool University, we will be very keen to help develop a digital archive, which is, I think, critical for Chandernagore, because so much of the heritage is being lost, but also so much of the knowledge is being lost in that process, so that we cannot help the stakeholders eventually. So I would be very keen that as part of the Hooghly River of Cultures, but also as part of RKM and part of the Liverpool University and part of the Hooghly INTACH, we would be able to develop a voluntary approach to structuring a digital archive and to structuring this advising process.
Thanks, Showman. If I could, this is Ian Magadera here. If I could just thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And, you actually linked and made present for us like a walk from the house down through the lanes to the ghat to the temple, you linked the buildings, the architectural assets through lived experience, and I think that's a crucial thing about cultural landscapes. But I just want to come back to that very interesting slide that you presented right at the start regarding the pathway to possible World Heritage status. I'd just like to ask you to sketch out again a little bit more about how you see this, the accent, the procedure that people need to follow in relation to that. So not sketching out, not saying that these buildings or places are unique by themselves, but also, instead of that, saying also, and I think I've understood this correctly, about how they are understood today. If you could, correct me if I'm wrong, and just sketch out a little bit a key of the pathway to World Heritage status, if you would.
Thanks, Ian. No, that's a very relevant point, and I certainly think that, and I kind of raised that as a provocation, that whether we could think about the Liverpool, the Hooghly River region as a World Heritage Site, and I think that there are enough ingredients there to do so. Now, and I really strongly believe that the monument-specific approach is not the way to take, as I've said a number of times, and that we need to look into a dynamic cultural landscape approach. Now, what that means is that cultural landscapes are not static. Our anthropological engagement with buildings and landscapes is not static. It is a dynamic, it is an ever-changing one. Our engagement, our activities over a period of time have changed. Now, what I think is very important to understand is that some of the traces, and this is why I talked about the montage or the collage, or probably the word palimpsest is a better word, that some of the traces of our previous activities, my granddad did this in this room, or, there is this mark of something that happened, on the wall, at that time. Now, those tangible or intangible traces are really important, and we need to keep those going and intact. We need to find a creative way of actually making that happen. At the same time, I think the contemporary activities have to be enshrined as well. And this is where my argument towards making it relevant to today and the future is what comes in. Now, in order to do that, I think what is first and foremost relevant is that, we collect and organize the data surrounding the past and the present of our usage and activities and our anthropological engagement, if you like, with the built environment, and how we are reshaping it every time, and how some of the past traces live with us in the present, because the past in itself is not relevant at all unless it's present in the present. And that's one thing that, I think is quite crucial. And so we continue to present the past, in our heritage management. And in doing that, we need to therefore catalog, categorize, understand, interpret that material in the fullest possible way. Then that gives us a sense of significance of buildings and cultural landscapes. So significance is crucial. Why is it important? And I think that the significance cannot be, unfortunately, as the UNESCO suggests, cannot be a universal significance straight away, but the collective localized significances make the universal significance. And that's something that I have felt in many, many sites. Otherwise, we will not be able to create our sense of a World Heritage Site. These are World Heritage for all sorts of localized reasons as well. Now, once we have the significance, we also need to understand the threats. The threats can come from all kinds of directions, economic threats and so on and so forth, but also social threats, cultural threats, professional threats. We do not understand how we should engage. Planners and architects don't understand how to engage with these sites and so on. So we have the threats. And then we begin to engage with the local communities to develop a management strategy, which would be how should we approach it. Once we have established a strategy, we should then move into a phased master plan. Master plan does not mean we change everything around this area, but we have to take almost a kind of tactile approach that, there are certain points, critical points within the cultural landscapes which needs to be activated. The rest can lie dormant. By activating one point, you might actually be able to activate the rest of it. So therefore, a phased plan is not only an economic necessity, but also a necessity in principle. And then once that is happening, then alongside that, we need to look into the entire gamut of stakeholder engagement in this process. We need to understand where will the money come from, because, and I think the corporate social responsibility sector can play a big role. We can actually also generate revenues locally for restoration and rebuilding and new building and so on. So there are a number of things that one can do. Local businesses can put in money, with a view to getting return. Now, once we do that, a phased, and let's not forget that I think visibility of activities is important, that we are doing something and it's visible. Unless it's visible, it's not there in people's minds. So it's very important that while we start thinking about strategies, we also simultaneously start doing something so it's visible in the physical framework. And by doing that, it could be first simple things like garbage cleaning, the removal of garbage, painting or kind of cleaning up certain surfaces and so on. It can be as simple as that. Two, moving to gradually reordering some of these areas. And then I think those things and the more substantial interventions can take place together. So that would be the roadmap, I would say, for developing a World Heritage Site proposition.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Bandyopadhyay, for your lecture and for answering so many queries and questions. And we hope to work with you again after this pandemic is over. You will be here in Chandernagore, and we will look forward to planning more fruitful things. May I now request Dr. Ante? Yes, Shomanda.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, it's
Antara, we
always a
cannot
pleasure
hear
to
you.
listen to you. Hello, am I audible now?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you, Antara.
Okay, okay. All right. As I was saying, it's been a mesmerizing talk, and I have been listening to you with rapt attention, and thinking how less we all know and how much scope we have to learn from you. It's been such a pleasure to have listened to this talk, and of course to many more conversations that are coming on the way. So, on behalf of INTACH Hooghly Chapter, we thank you for the talk, for the time. I know how busy you are, and I know how difficult it must have been to squeeze this time out, especially during the weekends. We thank you so much, but we would like to have you again with us. We also thank our viewers, both here in Google Meet and also in Facebook Live, for their patient listening. And we also thank those who have interacted with us. So here we come to the end of our 8th lecture, and we are taking a week's break from this lecture series. It's the year end, so we are not going to have any lecture next week, but we are going to come back new year with Dr. Pinaki De, who would be talking about printing history in Hooghly. So we would have Pinaki De coming up on the 3rd of January at 7:30. Be with us for our 9th lecture of the series. So it's good night from all of us, and it's good morning to Moshumidi, who has logged in from the US. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Antara.
Thank you.